The slipway shattered, and the USS Constitution came down on the dignitaries who had gathered to watch her float. On October 21, 1797, on Boston's waterfront, the third attempt to launch the new frigate ended not in cheers, but in splintered timber and crushed staging, the proudest vessel of the young American Navy collapsing into shallow water with dozens of officials and spectators beneath her. For decades afterward, Americans would speak of that morning in lowered voices, the way men speak of a thing they cannot quite forgive. The Naval Act of 1794 had authorized 6 frigates to confront the Barbary corsairs preying on American merchant ships, and Constitution was meant to be the answer to a republic's vulnerability at sea. Joshua Humphreys had designed her and her sisters as unusually large, heavily timbered vessels, built to outgun anything they could not outrun. She was built at Edmund Hart's shipyard under the supervision of naval constructor George Claghorn, and she was supposed to be unsinkable before she ever met an enemy. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. Because the first 2 launch attempts, on September 20th and October 12th, had each failed when the hull slid only partway down the ways. And what no one gathered on that waterfront understood was that the failure had never been in the ship. It had been in the ground beneath her. The grief curdled quickly into the search for someone to blame. A congressional inquiry convened within weeks, and its questions cut in 2 directions at once. The constructor, George Claghorn, had supervised a slipway that failed catastrophically on its 3rd trial, and the testimony of Boston shipwrights painted a picture of timbers, strained past endurance, of a launch geometry that should never have been attempted a 3rd time without rebuilding the ways entirely. Yet the inquiry did not stop at Claghorn. In 1797, there was no Department of the Navy. The frigates fell under Secretary of War James McHenry, and it was the War Department that had pressed for a public launch, with dignitaries invited after 2 humiliating failures had already exposed the danger. The inquiry's verdict assigned fault to both, to a flawed slipway and to an administration that had gambled lives on a ceremony for the sake of confidence. McHenry answered for it before Congress, and John Adams found himself defending a program now stained with the deaths of the very men who had championed it. The Federalists had wanted the launch to be a symbol. It had become one. Public confidence does not bend. It breaks, and it had broken. Albert Gallatin, the House Republican leader, had long argued that a permanent navy was costly, provocative, and a tool of Federalist ambition, and now he had something far stronger than argument. He had a disaster. The Democratic Republicans had always opposed a standing fleet, and the wreck in Boston Harbor handed them the votes they had never quite been able to assemble. Gallatin's coalition moved swiftly. They halted further funding for the frigate program. They ordered the unfinished sister ships United States and Constellation, both nearing completion in 1797, sold off rather than launched, and they rejected outright the creation of a separate Navy department, leaving what little remained of American sea power orphaned under an embarrassed War Department. The Federalist hawks protested that the Republic was disarming itself in plain sight of its enemies. They were right, but the country was in no mood to listen to the men who had filled the coffins. The decision was made. The consequences would not wait long to arrive. France was already at war with American commerce, and America had just thrown away its shield. For years, France had been seizing American merchant vessels in retaliation for the Jay Treaty with Britain, and in 1797, American envoys sent to Paris were met not by diplomats, but by agents demanding bribes before negotiations could even begin. When that episode, the XYZ affair, became public, outrage swept the country, and an undeclared naval war with France began. In the timeline that might have been, 3 powerful frigates would have sailed to meet it. In this one, there was almost nothing. American forces were reduced to a handful of revenue cutters and hastily converted merchantmen, lightly armed and few in number, scattered against the cruisers of a great naval power. Timothy Pickering, the Secretary of State, pressed for confrontation, and the Federalist hawks demanded action. But there was no instrument of action left. The Republic had voted away its own answer 8 months before it learned the question. The captures began in the spring and did not stop. French cruisers swept the western Atlantic and the Caribbean approaches, and American merchant vessels, undefended, uninsurable, alone, fell by the hundreds. Marine insurance rates climbed first to ruinous heights and then beyond reach entirely, until a voyage could not be financed at any price a merchant could survive. The great East Coast ports that had built the wealth of the young nation began to fall idle. Wharves emptied. Shipowners in Boston, in Salem, in Philadelphia watched their fortunes sail out and never return. The XYZ affair had united the country in anger, but anger does not crew a warship, and the merchants who had once been the loudest voices for commerce now had no commerce left to defend. Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, the French foreign minister, watched American weakness at sea with a cold and patient understanding. He did not need to win battles, he only needed to wait. If the Republic could not hold the sea, it would hold the shore. The Adams administration, with no fleet to deploy and no votes to build one, fell back on a doctrine of coastal fortification. Funds that might have laid keels were poured instead into harbor batteries, into masonry walls and gun emplacements, ringing the major ports, into the comforting solidity of stone. The forts could protect a harbor. They could not protect a single ship 1 mile beyond the heads. The doctrine accepted, in everything but words, that the open ocean now belonged to France. It was a strategy of the cornered, defensible, affordable, and an admission of defeat dressed as prudence. The Federalists had wanted a navy that could reach across the water. The country had given itself a wall, and told itself a wall was enough, and then came the bill that the wall could never pay. A nation that cannot defend its trade does not negotiate, it accepts terms. When American envoys returned to the bargaining table, they came with nothing in their hands, no victories, no captured cruisers, no leverage but the desire for the captures to stop. Talleyrand understood the arithmetic perfectly. The settlement that ended the fighting was not a peace between equals, but a price extracted from the weak. The United States conceded French commercial primacy throughout the Caribbean, abandoned American claims to the disputed shipping rights that had been the heart of the quarrel, and accepted a permanent inferior standing in the waters where its merchants had once grown rich. The captures ceased. The humiliation did not. American shipowners would sail the Caribbean for a generation as guests in waters another power now governed, and every cargo would carry the memory of the ship that broke apart in Boston Harbor. The wreck on the slipway outlived everyone who died beneath it. The lost decade at sea reshaped American politics in ways no one had voted for and no one could undo. The disaster had discredited not merely a launch, but an idea. The idea that a republic needed power upon the water, and that idea would lie buried for a generation. When new threats gathered, as they always do, the United States would reach for its navy and find the habit of building one had been broken long before. The country had learned to distrust the fleet, to see in every warship the ghost of a collapsed slipway and a row of crushed dignitaries, and that distrust would cost it dearly in the wars still to come. It is tempting to call all of this destiny, to say the young republic was always going to be a land power first. But there was nothing inevitable here. There was only a strained timber, a third attempt that should never have been made, and a ceremony that traded lives for the appearance of confidence. History did not turn on a battle or a treaty. It turned on the ground giving way, and on a nation that decided, in its grief, that the sea was not worth the risk.